Hello, BookTube. Well, it's Wednesday, and that means Epic Comic Book Wednesday, when Michael K. Vaughan and I combine the forces of stately Vaughan Manor and Hyde Cottage to talk about comic books. And since this whole feature started out innocently on Mike's channel, and I horned my way in, he gets to pick what we talk about. And that can lead to problems. That can lead to some problems. Because when his own personal taste in comics does not precisely coincide with my own, it tends to be horrible, deplorable. So we have, over the years that we've been doing this, and the four of you have been watching, we've had our share of disagreements. But the key that I always want to stress to you is that I don't know what those disagreements will be ahead of time. Mike and I don't chat about... He doesn't run plans by me. He drops his pick on me, usually a day out, something like that, and says, this is what we're doing. So I'm not always sure. In this particular instance, I got his pick early. And that would have caused, I don't know, a week and a half of agony, mental agony, if it had been a crappy pick. But instead, it's a crappy pick, all right. It definitely coincides with Garb August, but it's an interesting one. But nevertheless, it has its share of problems, and mainly two. Because the comic book that we're talking about this time around, we're going back to the 70s, the Fons et Orgo of crap. We're going back to the 70s, we're doing Marvel Comics, and we're doing this, Werewolf by Night. Let me, since we're going to be looking at this, let me turn down the brightness just a bit there so that you can make out the details. The brightness is on full blast here. Let's go back to there. Yeah, Werewolf by Night is what we're doing. Sorry, I'm blocking my own werewolf in the video here. And this... Here you have, this is the cover to the Marvel Masterworks edition that came out. I think Marvel made two Marvel Masterworks of this. Marvel Masterworks were old hardcover, full-color reprint volumes. They weren't cheap. They were $75 a piece. And I remember when this one came out thinking, oh, come on. Come on. You're going to do a Masterworks volume of Werewolf by Night? What's next? Howard the Duck? And I think they did a Masterworks volume of Howard the Duck. But the problem that we're going to run into, we're going to run into two problems when we talk about this. I haven't seen Mike's video yet. He posts them, he makes them the night before, so he posts them first thing in the morning. I haven't got to his video yet today. But we're going to hit two problems, he and I, when it comes to this subject matter. And briefly stated, those two problems are, number one, monsters, and number two, an artist named Mike Ploog. Those of you who have not been watching Epic Comic Book Wednesday for years now, or maybe you're not familiar with Mike's channel, you should go and subscribe. If there's any chance that you're watching this channel and not watching his, you should go and subscribe. But if you're familiar with his channel, you will know that he loves monsters. He's a big fan of monsters. Loves monster comics, monster novels, you name it. You give him a book that he has no interest whatsoever in reading, let's say the latest Harlequin romance, he'll walk right by it. You tell him that the latest Harlequin romance has a 50-foot talking ape, and he'll read it immediately. That's problem number one, because I think monsters are lame, especially in a visual medium. I think they're lame. They don't do much for me at all. Usually. There is an exception. This is an exception. We'll get to that. And then problem number two is Mike Ploog. Michael K. Vaughan is a big fan of the art of Mike Ploog. And, of course, what you're a big fan of is totally up to you, but that has always been mystifying to me. Michael K. Vaughan is actually not the first person that I've met who had that particular sweet spot, and most of them have said to me in the back rooms of conventions or in the trading basement of a comic shop, have said, he's an acquired taste. You need to learn to like him. Well, I've acquired some tastes in my time. I got to like Howard Chaykin's artwork. That's not entirely easy to do. But Mike Ploog, he's not an acquired taste. Have you ever noticed that when people say that X is an acquired taste, they have one of two meanings. Either they mean that after a while you're going to get used to it and maybe even come to like X, or they mean that after a while you're just going to give up. and that's what Mike Ploog is. He's, well, in deference to Michael K. Vaughan, he's an acquired taste. I think he's an awful artist. Just awful. I think he is the artist for the early issues of Werewolf by Night. that was created in the 1970s as part of the monster boom of Marvel Comics that was to introduce a whole bunch of other things. Marvel had a run with Frankenstein's monster. They also had legendarily a run. Well, they had Man-Thing. They had the shambling swamp monster Man-Thing. But also legendarily, they had Tomb of Dracula. Which, from all of that monster stuff, I was... the creature from the Black Lagoon even shows up in a Fantastic Four issue. I got so sick of it because I'm not part of the monster mania type thing. I think Marvel also did The Living Mummy for at least a couple of issues. In their superhero era, I think they did The Living Mummy. But the one that was genius was Tomb of Dracula, which Mike and I have talked about in Epic Comic Book Wednesday. And we'll probably talk about again. The Tomb of Dracula was great almost from the beginning, and then it grew into an even greater amount of its own power, of its own pacing. But none of the other monster things did. Including Werewolf by Night, which I'm not 100% sure of the origin story. Roy Thomas, the great comic writer Roy Thomas, writes the introduction to this Marvel Masterworks volume and tells the origin story of how this idea came about, how he thought Marvel should have a werewolf character who is not the son of J. Jonah Jameson. Marvel should have an actual werewolf character, a supernatural, curse in the family, activated under a full moon werewolf character in our roster. And according to the introduction that Roy Thomas writes for this volume, he was pretty sure that he would need just a few seconds of talking about that to Stan Lee to get the green light. And of course that would be true. That part of his anecdote, I don't doubt for a minute Stan Lee would say yes. And according to his essay in here, and I keep saying that because every once in a while I wonder about some of Roy Thomas's origin stories. I think he's almost entirely a truthful writer. But be that as it may, he says that it was Stan Lee who came up with the admittedly ridiculous title of Werewolf by Night. Like, as Roy Thomas puts out in his introduction, like you're going to have a werewolf during the day. Although, ironically enough, by the time this comic's wretched run was over, you are getting a werewolf during the day. But this started out in Marvel Spotlight, and then fans liked it enough, and I imagine some of those fans liked it because of Mike Ploog's artwork. Let me give you an example to show you what I'm talking about here, as long as I'm vilifying the guy. There you go. Now, I admit that panel layout has atmospherics. And it's got the big reveal at the end, a guy with a knife confronting an elementary school boy in a cheap costume. He's confronting someone who's 3 feet tall. So all the foreboding that's built up by these panels is ruined by this one. And that, to my mind, happens often with Mike Ploog. I mean, admittedly, you've got atmospherics. But this is the story of a teenager, Jack Russell Terrier. He's a 70s teenager, so he acts and looks like a 40-year-old. He wears skin-tight clothing, as all the young teenagers in the 1970s did. Steve approved. He has long hair. He has ridiculous sideburns. He has a hey man, don't you jive me attitude. It's a very accurate reflection. I wonder if we can have a quick picture of him. Yeah, there we go. A very accurate reflection of a 70s teenager. They were, by turns, angelically wonderful and incredibly irritating. And Jack Russell Terrier has these horrible dreams and doesn't realize that they're actually real for a while, until he realizes that he does, in fact, inherit the family curse of being a werewolf. And turns into a werewolf at the full moon. And narrates his own story. So we're not getting a normal werewolf here. Because Jack Russell Terrier has some awareness as a werewolf. I think we saw that, right? Yeah, see, there are thought balloons. As a werewolf, he's talking to himself in English. So the purest distillation of the werewolf as a concept is not happening in this comic book. Obviously, it could not. The purest distillation of the werewolf is that there is a place change that happens. The human goes away, and the animal takes over. The animal runs rampant, and then the animal gives way to the human again. But here, the human is there a lot. I mean, the Jack Russell Terrier's werewolf persona kills and eats people. But not many people, because he's tiny. He's a scrawny little werewolf. He has barely any power at all. And as a result, in the course of these issues, he is slapped around, kicked around, I wonder if I'm going to be able to quickly go at it. Yeah, he can't hold his own against a wolf. One ordinary wolf. He can't manage to do that. But he also meets a writer in these issues. The writer stays for the whole length of the run. Just this dumb. Okay, see, all right. I don't want to just crap all over Michael K. Vaughan's childhood favorites. Stop. You get panels like this with Mike Ploog, okay? And the later artists on this book, Don Perlin, I think, is a later artist on this book, could not have done this panel. That is beautifully done. But it takes more than a comic. There's more to a comic than just that kind of a panel. See, here we go. This werewolf can't handle a single wolf, and he is routinely beaten up by ordinary guys as a werewolf. He's routinely beaten up by them, routinely on the edge of simply dying as a werewolf. I think you'd have to admit that a Hollywood werewolf that is not a danger to the human characters in the story would lose a lot of its punch. that werewolf would lose a lot of its punch, and this one does, because he has a whole lot of trouble facing down human opponents, and is routinely beaten in the course of these issues. At one point, the Cruella de Vil type character here chains him to a wall. Just ordinary chains, as a werewolf. And he pulls and pulls and pulls, and he can't do it. Can't do anything with it, so he's just stuck there. He's just a pet. Later on in the series, he's abducted by a circus that holds him as a pet. It doesn't exactly instill any kind of awe or foreboding when your main character, is insufferable in his civilian identity. You see, there we go. There's the skin-tight clothing I was talking about. The main character is insufferable in his civilian identity and insufferable in his, I guess for want of a better word, his superhero identity. That's pretty bad when both of those things are true. You don't have much for the reader to hold on to. See, one of the things, I read these issues when they were coming out, because I have a soft spot for the concept of the werewolf. Unlike the Frankenstein's monster, unlike Dracula, the concept of the werewolf is ancient. It goes back a long, thousands of years. And I have a soft spot for it. Obviously, as a piece of folklore in which a human being bridges the divide between the canine and the human, I would have a soft spot for it. I have a soft spot for the concept. I kept reading these issues, and it's just never done well. It got to the point when I was getting these issues where I was just sort of hoping for signature moments. I was perversely looking for the werewolf to get defeated in every issue, sometimes easily, sometimes simply by a henchman, a human henchman. And also there's another motif that crops up in these issues quite often, and that is Jack Russell Terrier starting awake half naked. That happens all throughout the issues. He even does it to Jarvis, the Avengers butler. Towards the end of this run, he does a classic Jack Russell Terrier, oh my God, where am I, waking up without his shirt on, with Jarvis. This is what I'm talking about. You get one of those scenes in practically every issue. This hapless loser. You see here, he just gets smacked around by just an ordinary guy who's sitting in his easy chair. He just gets smacked around. Here, the man is a big game hunter. He taunts Jack Russell Terrier, but then when the moon comes out, Jack Russell Terrier transforms into a werewolf, and the guy beats the crap out of him. As a werewolf, beats the crap out of him. That's not how that's supposed to happen. That's not supposed to be possible. and yet it happens all throughout here. Every time I kept hoping. See, eventually this changed to Werewolf by Night. Eventually got his own book. Here he's having a lot of trouble with a bunch of Lhasa Apsos. Eventually got his own book, but it didn't help any. Now, if you're a Mike Ploog fan, well, you're going to get Jack Russell Terrier and this artwork, these kind of compositions, frequently. And I admit there is some worth to these things, but what am I reading here? The whole point of, I would think, the whole point of reading a monster magazine is that if a normal person, especially a bad guy, encounters the monster in the monster's own territory, then the ordinary person will die. Right? I mean, it's a crowd of villagers with torches and pitchforks that torment Frankenstein's monster. It's not one villager. One villager will get his head popped off. It's an expert team of vampire hunters who will hunt Dracula. It's not one person that he happens to run across in a shadowy alley in Glasgow. You don't expect him to come to Gene Colan to draw him swooping down on that person in the alley and then have the fight of his life to drink their blood. No. The whole point of monster stories is that the normal human world is completely helpless against them. That's what makes them frightening. But not our werewolf. He is rather easily dealt with. All throughout these issues, he is rather easily dealt with. He either barely holds on, or he runs. And the way that the writers get around it, I think Jerry Conway wrote most of this. The way the writers get around it is to have Jack Russell Terrier do a lot of the fighting himself, so that of course he can have his troubles, because during the day and for 25 days of the month he's just an ordinary person. But his alter ego isn't much better. His alter ego is constantly beaten up, constantly knocked unconscious, constantly captured. And then later on in the series, I think this went on for a few years, without Marvel ever putting, no offense to Michael K. Vaughan, but without Marvel ever putting first-rate comic book talent on this thing. Maybe for an explicitly monster comic, which I would argue Werewolf by Night never was. Maybe for an explicitly monster comic, maybe a surreal thing like the House of Weird or something like that, maybe Mike Ploog would work as an artist. But he's not a superhero comic book artist. This setup, this banner, that price, this logo with the John Romita Sr. thumbnail up there, that means this is going to be in next to superhero comics. And Mike Ploog is not part of that world. No matter who you have ink him, he's not part of that world. And Marvel never saw that, or maybe they really liked his work, and they therefore never gave Werewolf by Night the kind of talent that would actually have worked to make it succeed. I think you could have worked to make it succeed, and you wouldn't have had to do what they do later on in the series, which is for Jack Russell Terrier to meet an ongoing cast of characters that will allow him gradually to control his werewolf habits. Eventually, he reaches a point where he can transform at will, daytime, nighttime, and maintains completely his ability not only to think like a normal human being, but later on in the run to speak like a normal human being, to be able to speak instead of just growling. And there's the introduction of a superpowered love interest. She has telepathic abilities that are ill-defined. Also, for a little while, we get another character from around this time, Brother Voodoo, who had a very effective first appearance drawn by Gene Colan. It was almost always mishandled after that. Brother Voodoo also showed up in a comic that we've already talked about that was a spin-off from Werewolf by Night, Moon Knight. The character of Moon Knight, the stupid lame-ass character of Moon Knight, who is always sneaking up on people even though he's lowering himself from a helicopter. That stupid dumbass knockoff character of Moon Knight started out as a character in Werewolf by Night. And the same thing is true in Moon Knight as in Werewolf by Night. When sales started to flag, the writers brought in Brother Voodoo and then mishandled him. Brother Voodoo is mishandled in Werewolf by Night, not nearly as badly as he is in Moon Knight. In Moon Knight, it's disgraceful what is done to that character. But if Marvel hadn't done that, see, this is what I'm talking about. This is why there's no defense to say that Mike Ploog was perfect for a horror comic book, because this was never just a horror comic book. Marvel's intent from the beginning was to work in Frankenstein's monster, the living mummy, Werewolf by Night, Dracula especially, into the mainstream Marvel superhero universe. And this issue, thankfully, is not drawn by Mike Ploog. It's drawn by the great Ross Andru. And a little bit of a weird thing, this is written by Len Wein. And the Werewolf by Night, Spidey is in San Francisco. The Werewolf by Night attacks him on Golden Gate Bridge. And fights with him. And I was thinking, all right, well, this is a fairly standard Ross Andru fight sequence. Probably didn't have more than 20 minutes to do this. And then I noticed what was odd about it. What was striking me as odd about it is that Spider-Man never speaks. He never speaks out loud. He's just fighting. Where he doesn't say, "Hey, who are you?" or "Hey, don't crowd me," or "Room for more than one on this bridge." He doesn't do any quips like that. He just fights Werewolf by Night until he gets to know Werewolf by Night, and then they get to be friends and colleagues. But what was the point I was... Oh, right. Marvel never sees beyond that. Like, for instance, that team-up, that Marvel team-up. Okay, I bought that. I was buying Marvel team-up at the time anyway. But naturally, I thought, okay, well, how about you put Ross Andru on Werewolf by Night for about 6 issues, maybe half a year, and see what that does. Or come up with a really good plot. I mean, Werewolf by Night, in his essential construction, is essentially the classic version of the Hulk, where a virtuous character, here not a haughty super teenager, but a nerdy scientist, transforms into a more powerful being. At least, I think a werewolf should be more powerful. This one is not. He's constantly being beaten by anybody. But that original concept of the Hulk is that normal person transforms into a monstrous being of rage and anger. That being has adventures and then transforms back. And you've got the pathos of that lifestyle. And that should have been the heart of Werewolf by Night. That same pathos. Instead, it goes off the rail and stays off the rail. And then you get to a comic book artist named Doug Mensch. Oh my God. If he shows up, you know that your ordinary comic book is going to be torturously overcomplicated and horribly written. He's basically the author version of George Tuska. You know that the end is near. And eventually, Werewolf by Night was canceled. Jack Russell Terrier is still part of the Marvel Universe. In fact, one of the... I'm going to be talking to you. Let me give you a cover here. And there we go. There's a Mike Ploog cover. One of the 2 follow-ups that I want to give you for this comic is related to the fact that Epic Comic Book Wednesday happens on a Wednesday. The reason we picked Wednesday, or the reason that Mike did, is because Wednesday is right now the new release day for American comic books. They come out on Wednesday. They all do, regardless of company. So if you're a comic book fan, I don't know why you would be in 2024, but if you are, you would go to your comic shop on Wednesday. You would go to the new release section of the comics, and you would browse there for what's new that week. And as coincidence would have it, I don't think Mike knows this, but as coincidence would have it, today, this Wednesday, Marvel Comics is publishing Werewolf by Night #1. They're reviving this character, probably for copyright reasons. I don't think there's any much great call for it, but if you are interested, I will gladly review that issue. I know that Hannah would want me to, because she can't get enough of comics content, but that's happening today. So that's one call out at the end of this video, is that this character is not dead. Not metaphorically and also not legalistically. Marvel still has an active interest in Werewolf by Night. No idea what direction they will take with the new issue. If I remember correctly, the new issue, the main character is still Jack Russell Terrier. But that can't stay true, because Marvel Comics doesn't have any male main characters. So maybe he dies in the first issue and is replaced by a 5-foot-tall girl boss who don't need no man. I don't know when that will happen. I know that will happen. I don't know when that will happen. But that's call out #1. And call out #2 is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The Marvel Cinematic Universe did a very strange and very effective one-shot little production of Werewolf by Night. As far as I know, it was never in movie theaters. Never had a chance to earn $1 billion. It stars Gael Garcia Bernal as Jack Russell Terrier, as Werewolf by Night. It's filmed wonderfully. It's paced wonderfully. It has some wonderfully funny character actors in it. It has a flaw because, of course, it's made by the current version of Hollywood. So all the effective characters in the thing that are human are women. The winners of all contests, physical, mental, moral, whatever, are all women. The day is saved by a woman. The plot turns on the actions of women exclusively. The men are basically non-entities. The Werewolf by Night figure at the heart of the Werewolf by Night story is fairly well done, as is the aforementioned man thing. And Despite the fact that there's all that sex pandering that Hollywood cannot stop doing, will not stop doing, Marvel's Werewolf by Night is actually very much worth your time to watch. It's actually very, very good. So believe it or not, I'm recommending a little Marvel Cinematic one-shot. It's a loving homage to a lot of really stylized horror movies, and it's also wonderful. It's a really, really good use of special effects, which, I have always said, you want to overwhelm me with special effects, fine. You want to do that, fine. If it's done well, like the end of Avengers Endgame, I will be on board for you overwhelming. But I'd rather that you use your special effects really well. I'd rather that you do that. Right? I mean, you've got the big disposable army fight at the end of a Marvel movie. Think the end of Age of Ultron, where Ultron sends all of his robot minions to fight the Avengers, and it's amazing, and it's visually incredible, and they've got to save this falling city and whatnot, and it's all visually overwhelming. Okay. And it's done well, so you sit there and you're bombarded and you're overwhelmed. Great. But think about Guardians of the Galaxy. When Yondu sacrifices his life, right there in the arms of the boy that he raised like a son. And the only special effect in that scene is his face freezing over as he dies. And the force field over Star-Lord's head. That's it. It's very minimal special effect. It's every bit as moving, every bit as effective. I would argue every bit as effective as that final scene in Age of Ultron. So I definitely cheer Marvel's Werewolf by Night because it's special effects intelligently done. So there you go. 2 parting shots. There's a new Werewolf by Night, #1, out in comic shops today. Despite the fact that this thing is 50 years old. And there's also that movie. No idea where that movie is. No idea where you could find it. It's on a Marvel. I'm sure it's on a streaming service somewhere. But if you have access to it, you should watch it. But anyway, that's it. That's our comic for today. It's Werewolf by Night. Frat boy by night. He's completely useless for the whole of his run. So he turns into a werewolf, and you're not even frightened. You don't even feel vicarious fear because a guy can beat him up. So you come across Jack Russell Terrier in an alley in New York City. A mugger does with a knife and says, "All right, this is easy pickings. Hand over your wallet, mister." And Jack Russell Terrier turns over just slightly, and the moon is coming down into the alley, and he says, "No, you don't understand. You're in great danger." And then he transforms into a werewolf, and it's still even odds as to whether or not the mugger will just kill him and take his green pants. That kills the mood for me, even when the character is not a Kryptonian. So anyway, we'll see what we do next week. This was a lot of fun. I have a lot of affection for the werewolf character just in general. So it was a pleasure to reread all of these issues. We'll see if that pleasure sustains itself next time. Probably not, but it's up to Mike. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.